Something strange happened to Shedeur Sanders long before he ever threw a meaningful NFL pass. Not a bad game. Not a locker room blow-up. Not a public meltdown. Instead, his image started changing in real time, quietly, subtly, and almost all at once. One week, he was being discussed as a poised, confident quarterback with elite pedigree. The next, the conversation shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't about reads, accuracy, or decision-making. It was about attitude, arrogance, body language, unwritten rules he allegedly broke without anyone clearly explaining how. And that's where eyebrows started going up. Because these narratives didn't come after failure. They came before opportunity. Shedeur hadn't flamed out. He hadn't demanded a trade. He hadn't embarrassed a franchise. Yet the tone around him felt decided. Even more curious. Most of the loudest voices pushing these labels admitted they'd never actually been around him. No closed-door interviews, no locker room access, just opinions echoing other opinions. That's when fans started asking an uncomfortable question. Was this really about football? Or was something else shaping the conversation? While the takes kept flying, Shedeur stayed quiet. No social media rants, no public clapbacks, no victim narrative. He kept showing up, kept working, and kept speaking with a level of composure most rookies don't show under half the scrutiny. Then, right as the noise peaked, something unexpected happened. Coach Prime didn't hint. He didn't subtweet. He didn't let it slide. On one of the biggest media stages of the year, he directly challenged the way Shedeur had been portrayed and forced a reporter to acknowledge what many fans had been saying all along. That some of the criticism wasn't just harsh. It wasn't just premature. It crossed into something else entirely. And once that door opened, the entire situation looked different. Because when you strip away the takes, the clips, and the recycled talking points, one reality remains. Young quarterbacks don't usually get labeled before they fail. So why did Shedeur Sanders? And who benefited from that version of the story being told? Because what happened next didn't just expose a media moment. It exposed how fast a narrative can outrun the truth. Draft night is supposed to be simple. Your name gets called. Your future begins. The story writes itself. But for Shedeur Sanders, the story changed before the pick was ever made. All week, the conversation around him felt unstable. Analysts hedged, panels danced around his name, and instead of breaking down his film, the focus drifted somewhere else entirely. By the time draft night arrived, something felt off. Not loud. Not obvious. Just different. As teams passed, the tone subtly shifted. The excitement faded, the language hardened, words like confidence quietly turned into ego, preparation became entitlement. And suddenly the questions weren't about whether Shedeur could play, but whether teams wanted him. That's when fans noticed the pattern. Every slip in the draft came with a new explanation. Not scheme fit. Not roster needs. Not long-term planning. Instead, vague concerns started circulating. Reports claimed interviews did go well. Rumors suggested teams were unsure about his personality. One detail kept getting repeated: headphones during interviews, as if that alone explained everything. But here, what raised eyebrows. None of those stories came with names. No verified sources. No direct quotes. Just anonymous whispers that moved faster than facts. And while those narratives spread, something else happened quietly in the background. The same outlets questioning Shedeur's intangibles had praised him months earlier. Same player, same tape, same resume. The only difference: draft pressure. That's when the conversation stopped being about evaluation and started feeling like positioning. Some fans believe teams didn't want to deal with the Sanders spotlight. Others argue media voices adjusted their tone once it became clear he wouldn't be an early pick. Nothing confirmed. Nothing proven. But the timing was impossible to ignore. As the rounds passed, the silence around Shedeur grew louder. Cameras caught him calm, smiling, composed, no frustration, no visible cracks. Meanwhile, the commentary around him grew sharper, almost impatient, like people were waiting for a reaction that never came. And that may have been the real problem. Because draft night didn't expose a flaw in Shedeur Sanders. It exposed how quickly perception can override performance. By the time his name finally came off the board, the narrative had already shifted from potential franchise quarterback to question mark. Not because of a bad season, not because of a collapse, but because the story had changed and no one hit pause to ask why. And that wasn't the end of it. Because once he arrived in Cleveland, that draft night narrative didn't disappear. It followed him. Cleveland didn't just inherit a quarterback. It inherited a storyline. From the moment Shedeur Sanders arrived, the coverage split almost instantly. National voices kept a distance. Local media leaned in, but not always the same way. Some treated him like a long-term project, others framed him like a ticking clock. And that's where things quietly turned. Instead of easing a rookie into the city, certain narratives hardened fast. Every practice rep was dissected. Every facial expression turned into a headline. If he smiled, it was swagger. If he stayed quiet, it was aloof. Normal rookie behavior suddenly carried extra weight. That's when fans started asking uncomfortable questions. Why was a late-round quarterback getting star-level scrutiny? Why did minor details feel amplified? And why did the tone feel personal? Some reporters questioned his fit in Cleveland before he ever took a meaningful snap. Others openly speculated about how long his leash would be. A few even floated replacement scenarios months before camp battles were settled. None of it officially confirmed. All of it heavily implied. What made it stranger was the contrast inside the building. Teammates spoke positively. Coaches stayed measured but consistent. No public friction, no visible locker room tension, yet outside the facility the narrative kept drifting toward doubt. That disconnect didn't go unnoticed. Fans began revisiting old clips, old articles, old takes, and patterns started to emerge. Voices that once praised his college composure now questioned his maturity. Analysts who applauded his preparation now hinted at distractions. Same player, different framing. Some fans believe the city wasn't ready for a quarterback who didn't fit the traditional mold. Others think the Sanders name brought expectations and resistance at the same time. A few argue it was simply media hedging, keeping distance in case things didn't work out. No proof, just perception. But perception matters. Because when a narrative settles early, it shapes everything that follows. Mistakes feel bigger, success feels temporary, and silence gets interpreted instead of respected. Through it all, Shedeur didn't push back publicly. No interviews firing shots, no cryptic posts, no complaints. He stayed measured, often deflecting credit and brushing off noise. That restraint may have frustrated critics. Because controversy feeds attention, and Shedeur wasn't giving it any fuel. Yet the divide remained. Inside the building, optimism stayed quiet. Outside, skepticism stayed loud, and hovering over all of it was one uncomfortable reality. Cleveland wasn't just evaluating a quarterback. It was deciding which version of the story it wanted to believe. And that decision would only get harder once his voice and his father's entered the conversation. Because that's when the narrative stopped being subtle. Shedeur didn't call anyone out by name. He didn't need to. During Super Bowl week, while cameras chased headlines and sound bites, he chose a different approach. Calm, measured, almost detached, and that's what made it hit harder. Instead of attacking the criticism, he reframed it. He talked about jobs, about how media runs on attention, about how narratives get shaped for clicks, not context. It sounded reasonable, almost forgiving. But the subtext was impossible to miss. He wasn't denying the noise. He was explaining why it existed. That alone shifted the conversation. Because when a young quarterback acknowledges the machine without fighting it, it exposes the machine. No outrage, no emotion, just clarity, and suddenly the criticism didn't look analytical anymore. It looked transactional. Some fans believe that moment changed how teammates saw him. Others think it confirmed what coaches already knew. Either way, the response online was immediate. Clips spread fast, quotes got replayed, and people started asking why a rookie sounded more composed than some of the analysts judging him. What stood out most wasn't what he said, it was what he refused to say. He didn't complain about being doubted. He didn't mention the draft slide. He didn't reference specific reports. He talked about character, about people who actually know him versus people who only know the story. That distinction landed quietly but deeply, because in the NFL, proximity matters, film rooms matter, practice habits matter, and those details rarely make headlines. That's when another layer came into focus. Shedeur wasn't speaking as a victim. He was speaking as someone aware of how this league works. And that awareness rattled people. Because young quarterbacks are supposed to react, they're supposed to defend themselves, they're supposed to tweet, clap back, or crack under pressure. Shedeur did none of that. He stayed still. And that forced the spotlight elsewhere. Fans began re-evaluating the coverage. Old takes resurfaced. Clips were compared, and the question quietly shifted from "is he ready?" to "why does he need to prove anything already?" Some reporters softened, others doubled down, a few stayed silent. But the tone had changed. Because once a player shows he understands the narrative game and refuses to play it, the power balance shifts. The noise loses leverage, the speculation loses urgency. And just when it seemed like the moment would pass, another voice stepped in. Not to whisper, not to hint, but to confront the narrative head-on. And that's when the situation escalated from media tension to a league-wide conversation. Shedeur handled the moment with restraint. Coach Prime did not. When Deion Sanders stepped in front of a reporter during Super Bowl week, the tone shifted instantly. This wasn't frustration boiling over, this was something more deliberate, controlled, surgical. He didn't rant. He didn't raise his voice. He asked a question. "Did you sabotage my son?" That single line landed like a pause button on the entire conversation. Because suddenly this wasn't about draft grades or quarterback mechanics. It was about accountability, about who shapes narratives and who benefits from them. Coach Prime didn't accuse without context. He walked the reporter back through history, reminded him of how Shedeur had shown up. Respectful, professional, prepared, he pointed out the contradiction between private praise and public silence. And that's where it got uncomfortable. The reporter admitted something rarely said out loud, that the negative talk went too far, that it crossed into character attacks, that some of it simply wasn't true. Those words mattered. Because when someone inside the media ecosystem acknowledges that a narrative snowballed beyond facts, it validates what fans had been arguing for months, that the criticism wasn't just football-related. It was amplified, recycled, repeated until it stuck. Some fans believe this moment exposed how quickly reputations can be shaped without evidence. Others think it was a calculated power move by a father who understands the media game better than most. Either way, the exchange went viral for a reason. It pulled the curtain back. Coach Prime didn't ask for special treatment. He asked for consistency. If Shedeur was praised behind closed doors, why wasn't that reflected publicly? If he checked every box in interviews, why did rumors outweigh reality? Those questions lingered. And they didn't just affect one reporter, they echoed across platforms. Analysts who had been loud weeks earlier suddenly treaded carefully. Some clarified their takes, others avoided the topic altogether. The silence was telling. Because Deion Sanders isn't just defending his son, he's challenging a system that thrives on ambiguity, one where impressions matter more than access, where perception can outweigh preparation. That confrontation didn't erase criticism, but it forced a reset. Now every take carried more weight, every report faced scrutiny. Fans started asking who actually had first-hand knowledge and who was just repeating noise. And in a league where confidence often gets mistaken for arrogance, that moment reframed everything. What once looked like entitlement began to look like composure. What was labeled arrogance started to resemble self-awareness. But the biggest shift hadn't happened yet. Because while the media debated tone and optics, something else was happening quietly, far away from cameras. Inside the building. And that's where the real story was starting to form. While the media argued over tone and optics, the Browns' facility stayed locked in. No viral clips. No debate shows. Just work. And that's where the disconnect really started to show. Reports from inside the building painted a much quieter picture. Shedeur wasn't campaigning, he wasn't clapping back, He wasn't trying to win anyone over. He was doing the one thing that never trends online: stacking consistent days. Coaches noticed it first. Meetings ran longer and he stayed. Film sessions ended and he stayed. Veterans filtered out and he stayed. That kind of behavior doesn't guarantee anything in the NFL, but it earns something far more valuable early on: trust. Some fans believe that's why the internal tone never matched the outside noise. While commentators questioned leadership and maturity, teammates saw preparation. While analysts talked about intangibles, the staff tracked execution. And execution travels. One assistant reportedly pointed out how quickly Shedeur absorbed adjustments. Not flashy changes, subtle ones: footwork tweaks, progression timing, situational awareness, the boring stuff that separates prospects from professionals. That's when the conversation quietly shifted. Because raw talent gets you drafted, reliability keeps you around. Veterans began to notice too, not because Shedeur demanded attention, but because he didn't. He asked questions, he listened. He owned mistakes without excuses. In a locker room that's seen hype come and go, that approach stood out. None of this made headlines, but it mattered. Some reports claim the coaching staff grew frustrated with how far the public narrative drifted from their daily reality. They weren't seeing a distracted rookie. They were seeing someone intentionally shrinking the gap between potential and production. And that's dangerous in the best way, especially when expectations are low. Because when a player is written off early, every positive step feels bigger internally. Every clean rep adds leverage. Every quiet improvement chips away at doubt. That's how momentum builds without anyone noticing. It also explains why the organization never rushed to correct the media narrative. They didn't need to. They had their own evaluation running in real time. And it didn't match what was being said on TV. But here's the twist. Even with all that progress, the situation was never guaranteed. Contracts still loomed, depth charts still existed, and the NFL doesn't hand out patience for free. Which meant Shedeur wasn't just competing against expectations. He was competing against time. Because sooner or later, the outside noise would collide with internal decisions. And when that happened, someone would have to choose between perception and performance. That's when things usually get messy. And sure enough, the tension didn't stay contained for long. Because once preseason whispers started leaking, the entire conversation changed again. It always starts quietly. A throw in practice that turns a few heads. A rep that looks a little sharper than expected. A decision that feels intentional. That's when whispers stop being harmless. According to reports, once preseason prep ramped up, the Browns' quarterback room stopped feeling theoretical. Reps mattered, timing mattered, and suddenly every snap carried weight. Some fans believe this is where the pressure really shifted. Because once a player starts outperforming expectations, the organization has a choice to make. Do you lean in, or do you slow it down to protect the plan you already sold? That question hung over Cleveland. Shedeur wasn't loud, he wasn't forcing moments. But he was doing something far more uncomfortable for a franchise: juggling optics and reality. He was making the competition undeniable. Coaches reportedly began rotating reps more intentionally, not as a statement, as an evaluation, and that subtle change didn't go unnoticed inside the building. Veterans talk. When a quarterback starts getting extra looks, players feel it immediately, receivers adjust, linemen pay closer attention. The room tightens up. That's when the pressure moves beyond the practice field. Because now it's not just about development, it's about direction. Some reports claim the staff faced growing tension between staying patient and rewarding performance. Cleveland had already invested narratives elsewhere. Revering course too early would raise eyebrows. But ignoring progress carries its own risk. And that's where things started to get complicated. Media narratives didn't help. Every rumor was magnified, every quote was dissected, and instead of cooling down, the noise fed itself. Some fans believe this was intentional. Others think it was just the media doing what it always does, chasing reaction instead of context. Either way, the result was the same. Pressure escalated. Inside the building, evaluation continued. Outside the building, opinions hardened, and the gap between the two only widened. That's a dangerous place for a franchise to sit. Because when public expectations clash with internal belief, someone ends up uncomfortable. A coach, a veteran, a front office executive. Or a rookie who suddenly realizes he's no longer just developing, he's challenging the order of things. And that's when the stakes change. Because once a player forces the conversation, there's no going back to anonymity. Every rep is scrutinized, every mistake amplified, every success questioned. Shedeur had officially crossed that line. Not because of hype, not because of his name, but because his play demanded attention. And what happened next didn't come from the field at all. It came from the microphones. It wasn't a play that set things off. It was a sentence. Once the microphones came out, everything shifted. What had been a controlled internal evaluation suddenly spilled into the public space, and that's where situations like this get messy fast. A coach answered a question a little too carefully. A veteran paused before responding. A media member connected dots that maybe weren't meant to be connected yet. And just like that, tone replaced facts. Nothing explosive was said. That's the part people miss. There was no outright declaration, no nomming of names, but when answers start getting vague instead of confident, people notice. Fans noticed. Analysts noticed. And inside the building, players definitely noticed. Because locker rooms are built on clarity, even when competition exists, players want to know where they stand. And when messaging starts to feel rehearsed instead of direct, uncertainty creeps in. Some reports suggest that's when tension quietly entered the room. Not hostility, not drama, just unease. Quarterbacks are different. Every comment about development, patience, or long-term vision gets filtered through one question: who is this really about? And when Shedeur's name kept coming up, even indirectly, it pulled him further into the spotlight. The media didn't help. One clip turned into 10 takes, one quote became a headline, and suddenly the story wasn't about practice reps anymore. It was about control. Who controls the timeline? Who controls the narrative? And who benefits if things slow down? That's when fans began to split. Some believed the organization was protecting the rookie, shielding him from pressure. Others felt the opposite, that the cautious language was a way to pump the brakes without saying it outright. Neither side could prove it, and that ambiguity fueled everything. Inside the building, the evaluation never stopped, but outside, the conversation had already taken a life of its own. And here's the thing about young quarterbacks. Once the public starts debating readiness, the player doesn't need to say a word for expectations to rise. Every throw becomes a statement. Every clip becomes evidence. Every mistake becomes ammunition. Shedeur stayed quiet through it all. No social media responses. No subtle shots. No let my play speak quotes. But silence can be louder than words, especially when the noise around you keeps getting louder. Because now, it wasn't just about earning reps, it was about surviving perception, about not letting outside pressure seep into decision-making inside the building. And that's where franchises get tested. Do you stay disciplined? Or do you react? Because once microphones set the temperature, even the smallest move can feel like a message. And the next move Cleveland made, subtle on the surface, told people more than any quote ever could. By the time everything settled, one thing was clear: this situation was never just about a rookie quarterback. It was about timing, power, and how quickly narratives can outrun reality in the NFL. Cleveland didn't make any loud declarations, no press conference to shut things down, no bold move to flip the depth chart overnight. On the surface, it looked calm, controlled, almost boring. But underneath that calm was a franchise walking a tightrope. Because when expectations meet uncertainty, every decision feels heavier than it actually is. Shedeur Sanders didn't force the issue. He didn't campaign for snaps. He didn't lean into the hype or try to win the media cycle. And in today's NFL, that restraint stood out just as much as a viral highlight would have. Some fans saw maturity. Others saw frustration being bottled up. Neither side really knew, and that's the point. What made this situation linger wasn't anything that happened on the field, It was the space between answers, the pauses, the carefully chosen words, the sense that everyone involved was trying not to say too much too soon. And that's where speculation thrives. Some believe Cleveland is playing the long game, developing quietly, protecting confidence, letting the moment come naturally. Others think the organization is hedging, unsure how fast they want this timeline to move with so much already at stake. There's no confirmation either way, just competing interpretations. But here's what can't be ignored: once fans and analysts start debating when instead of if, the clock has already started. Quarterback rooms feel that pressure even when no one admits it. Veterans feel it, coaches feel it, front offices feel it, and rookies, especially highly visible ones, feel it most of all. The NFL doesn't wait for perfect circumstances, it rewards decisiveness, and it punishes hesitation just as harshly as mistakes. Cleveland now sits at that crossroads. Every rep going forward will be analyzed. Every lineup decision will be framed as a signal. Every win or loss will be tied back to this moment, whether that's fair or not. And Shedeur, he remains the variable everyone keeps circling without fully addressing. Not because he's demanded anything, not because he's caused disruption, but because potential has a way of making organizations uncomfortable. It forces questions before teams are ready to answer them. So the real story isn't about what's happened so far. It's about what Cleveland does when the noise gets louder, the margin for patience gets smaller, and the league starts nudging instead of watching. Because when a franchise has a decision to make, the league always finds out. The only mystery left is how long Cleveland can keep this one quiet.